In this part of our Wallace family history, we'll be following Robert Wallace and his wife Helen Grant in their migration from Melrose in Scotland to Australia. Firstly, though, we'll look at two people who had a large impact on their lives. One of these was Sir Adam Ferguson, son of the famous Scottish philosopher. Ferguson had been a prisoner of the French in the Napoleonic Wars and was later appointed as Keeper of the Regalia of Scotland. He was a close friend of Sir Walter Scott, the celebrated novelist. Here we see Scott seated while Ferguson is standing next to him at the front. At the time, he was Scott's tenant residing at Huntly Burn on part of Scott's estates adjacent to the town of Melrose. In 1838, Robert Wallace was employed by Ferguson as a shepherd and perhaps as a part-time coach driver. He and Helen and their three children, William, Ferguson and Nancy, would have lived on Huntly Burn. Robert and Helen must have thought highly enough of Ferguson to name their second son after him. The other person of note in this story is the Reverend John Dunmore Lang. Lang was the first Presbyterian minister in Australia, a champion of democracy and of universal education. In the 1830s, the clearances in Scotland and Ireland and the Industrial Revolution left many unemployed and destitute in Britain. Meanwhile, in Australia, the use of convict labour was falling out of favour, and wages for free workers were relatively high. Lang was influential in persuading the British government to support a bounty scheme to assist suitable workers to migrate to Australia. Some years before, the Lang family had established the Dunmore estate near Maitland in the Lower Hunter Valley in New South Wales. Under John's younger brother Andrew, it came to be considered one of the best farming estates in the colony. By the 1830s, it covered 2,400 acres and included 5 miles of river frontage. In 1833, as if to mark the family's success, Dunmore House was built. 5 years later, in 1838, Dunmore was home to over 120 workers and their families, and it was here that Robert and his family were destined to come. Meanwhile, at Melrose, it was a few years after the death of Sir Walter Scott, and Adam Ferguson was soon to leave Huntly Burn. With widespread unemployment and wages falling, Robert must have seen little future in remaining in Britain. So in December of that year, probably after a final Christmas with their extended families, Robert, Helen and their children left Melrose on the first stage of their journey to Australia. Helen was again pregnant. Their journey was shared with George Broomfield, a shepherd, also from Melrose, and his wife Elizabeth, and their children Margaret, Thomas, Robert and Alexander. While the Broomfields were ultimately to be employed on another property in the Hunter Valley, 20 years later, Robert Broomfield and Nancy Wallace would be married. It was, of course, midwinter, and a journey by coach or wagon would have been very cold and uncomfortable, particularly for those riding in the cheaper seats, braving the elements. The journey from Melrose took them over the hills of Northumberland to Newcastle and then on to Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool. In Liverpool, their ship, the Formosa, had been forced into the wharf by a storm, and its departure was delayed for 3 weeks while repairs were made. Finally, on the 18th of January 1839, along with 250 other passengers, they set sail. Being bounty passengers, the Wallaces and Broomfields would have travelled in steerage, enduring cramped conditions, poor ventilation, meagre rations, and virtually no privacy. On the 21st of March, they reached Cape Town. Due to an outbreak of measles and smallpox on shore, the passengers were not permitted to leave the ship. 12 days later, on the 2nd of April, they sailed on into the Indian Ocean. Between Cape Town and the east coast of Australia, they encountered only 2 other ships. One of these had been damaged in a storm and had lost most of its provisions. Under the law of the sea, the Formosa would have shared what it had. From then on, rations in steerage must have been very thin indeed. During the 4-month journey, One passenger was lost overboard, and whooping cough took the lives of 15 children and one sailor. One of those children was 3-year-old Alexander Broomfield. In the same period, 8 children were born. On the 20th of May, no doubt with great relief, they reached Sydney, and the newspapers at the time reported that it was a fine sunny day. However, travelling from Sydney to the Hunter district by road at that time involved a very long and arduous journey. It is more likely that they travelled by paddle steamer, possibly on the Tamar, the Sophia Jane, or the William IV, all of which were operating at the time. After a call at Newcastle, they would have proceeded up the Hunter River to the village of Morpeth. On landing at Morpeth, they might have been taken by punt across the river and then walk, or been taken by wagon for the 5 kilometres to the Dunmore farm. Their other option was to take a smaller vessel for the short journey to Woodville, which is directly opposite Dunmore across the Patterson River. On arrival on Dunmore, they would have joined other workers who were accommodated in simple timber huts located next to the river. This building, which served as the first schoolhouse at nearby Largs, was originally one of the workers' cottages on Dunmore. This smaller hut is the last of the workers' houses on the original site. It is said to have been occupied up until the 1940s. Dunmore House itself was some distance away on a slight rise. On the 30th of June, only a few weeks after their arrival, Helen gave birth to a daughter, Margaret. At the time, most childbirths on the property took place in this outbuilding of Dunmore House, in what was then the kitchen. In the meantime, Robert would have been set to work on the property, but we don't know in what capacity. As they reached school age, the Wallace children would have attended a school established on the estate by the Lang family. We believe this school, with about 70 registered pupils, was located where the homestead on Belmore now stands. Just over 2 years later, on the 13th of September 1841, another daughter, Helen, was born. Unfortunately, Helen, the mother, became ill after the birth. She would have been nursed here in the dining room of Dunmore House until, on the 15th of January 1842, she died. Helen was buried on a part of the farm that was later subdivided to form the Belmore property. In 1999, I visited Dunmore House and spoke with a very old lady, a Mrs. Bessie Graham, who was a descendant of the last overseer on Dunmore. Her forebear bought the property when the last of the Langs died in the 1850s. Mrs. Graham recalled that when she was a child, her grandmother told her of the day that she and other children stopped their schoolwork to watch the nearby funeral procession for a young mother who had died. Through the interest and generosity of Bill and Val Woolstenholme, the current owners of Belmore, this little cemetery stands in memory of Helen and of 2 others who died in those early years. Val's mother's ashes are also scattered here. On Helen's death, Robert placed his 5 children in the care of other families. Not long after, he set off droving cattle over the mountains from the Monaro district to the newly explored region of Gippsland in Victoria. In 1847, before commencing another cattle drive to the south, he made a visit to Dunmore. When he left, he was accompanied by his sons, William, aged 14, and Ferguson, aged 12. Due to the tyranny of distance, Robert was to see his daughters only one more time, at Nancy's wedding to Robert Broomfield. The boys were not to see their sisters again. Those early years in Australia would not have been a happy period in our family's history. Nonetheless, Robert did not live without hopes and dreams. One of these would have been realised when some years later he became the first of his family to stand upon his own piece of land.